I'm Bruce Shapiro. I'm Executive Director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, based here at the Columbia Journalism School. The DART Center is dedicated to effective, ethical, and innovative reporting on violence and conflict and tragedy worldwide. Everything from the intimate sphere of family violence up to the global arena of war and international human rights. I bring greetings, first of all, to all of you from our dean, Nicholas Lemon, who was supposed to be here this morning, but who is sick. And he asked me to greet everyone, so I've done that on behalf of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome to the World Room and to this important symposium. On the morning of December 14th, many of the people in this room today were rushing toward Newtown, Connecticut, and toward, in particular, Sandy Hook Elementary School. Rushing as police officers and first responders, as family members, as community leaders, and as journalists. Nobody really knew what happened, and it was hard for a while to figure out what had happened. And then once we learned what happened, it was hard to apprehend, and it's still hard to apprehend the deaths of 26 children and teachers, a shooter and his mother. Over the course of the last 3 months, the Sandy Hook tragedy has entered, I think, a long second act as families and as a community and as a state. The people of Sandy Hook and Newtown and Connecticut have dealt with grief and mourning and anger. There's been a political aftermath that we're still in the middle of. Connecticut passed a sweeping gun bill and mental health bill. Congress defeated another gun bill. And there are a welter of issues that will be with us for a long time. Among those issues is the role of the press. Almost from the first hours of the tragedy, those of you in this room who were reporting and those of us in this room who were watching the news unfold witnessed enormous professional skill and dedication on the part of many journalists, witnessed as well some very tough, controversial choices, witnessed some big mistakes. We are going to talk about journalism and the press and the media in the aftermath of Sandy Hook over the course of today. It's an important discussion because, after all, journalism is the capillary system for democracy, and how we as citizens come to understand this event in particular, these losses in particular, these perpetrators this perpetrator in particular, this aftermath in particular, and also events like this, is going to shape the decisions that society makes. It's a big and important job. I have to say, as a resident of Connecticut, that I was often intensely proud of the local press corps. I also, like all of us in this room, I think, had moments of being a little bit stunned and appalled at some choices that were made. We're not here today, though, to point fingers particularly, though we can name names if we need to. Rather, we're here to go on a journey. First, to look back at the events of December 14th and the immediate aftermath of those shootings. And then walk a little bit through the experiences of journalists and families and community leaders, and then begin to look forward and ask first how journalists can go deeper in the aftermath of Sandy Hook and similar events, and ask then, where does the story go from here? And the story means the story for Newtown, the story for families, the story for Connecticut and this region, the story nationally as well. We are also here, of course, in the shadow of a very dark few days in Boston, up the road. We are all thinking about our friends and colleagues there. We are lucky enough to be joined later in the day by Kevin Cullen from the Boston Globe, who will bring that dimension with so many of the issues that we saw in Newtown playing out in different ways in Boston. I'm going to turn it over to Emily, my co-facilitator here, to say a few things. I have some more housekeeping when she's done, but let me say, first of all, this is being live streamed and taped by C-SPAN. Please turn your cell phones off or onto totally silent. And again, hashtag #AfterSandyHook. I'll come back with more housekeeping. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism here at Columbia. What we do is we help the school inform the curriculum around teaching students new techniques, and we have a research program here as well, which aims to look at how this world of journalism is being changed and transformed by the technologies that we use. When Bruce and I were talking about this originally, sort of two or 3 months ago, one of the things that I said was that whilst we tend to have a view that nothing ever changes, really we just sort of, some of us experience it for the first time, undoubtedly something has really changed about how news is reported. The inception of what we call the real-time social web, and by that I mean the invention of things like Facebook and Twitter, which mean that the lines between who are sources and who are reporters, how close you can be to an event in time, and it feels almost as like as though the world is collapsing sometimes in time and space, that we can all experience these really very immediate and often extremely traumatic events together. This changes the nature of reporting, and to some extent it changes the nature of news. It also has an impact, I think, not just on the arc of the stories, but on the individuals who are involved. So this is hopefully something, again, that we'll examine today, which is how can we, in this world where information proliferates from so many different sources so quickly, work not just as the press and the public, but more as a community that gathers around stories, to try and work out for ourselves best practices and standards which help get the best information to people as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, we know that we will be here again in one way or another in terms of how we report stories, because every single incident now has changed from that respect. And it's a great privilege to be here with people who've experienced that directly, who are willing to talk about it. Bruce has asked me a couple of housekeeping points. Please mute your phones because we are being streamed by C-SPAN, so we don't want kind of ringing, so you keep them on, they can be heard. I think there was another housekeeping point which I made. Oh, the hashtag I'll just repeat, which is #AfterSandyHook. Just to keep up, there are lots of people who would like to be here. Many of them actually reporters who would like to be here, but are already kind of involved, if you like, in covering the Boston story. So it's a good idea to sort of tweet out the interesting pieces of information that you hear. I'll hand back to Bruce because he will be chairing the first panel, and I think catching up with some housekeeping. And we have no swag, but we are the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism. Please, as I say, also, if you have questions that you want putting to any of the panelists through the day, my handle on Twitter is @EmilyBell, all one word. We are also @Tower Centre, TOWCENTER, I always get that wrong being British, and @Dart Centre. So if there are things that you feel that you want to say, but you don't necessarily want to say them in a public forum, please use all the available channels as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emily. And I do want to welcome not only the people in this room, but those who are watching on live stream and those who will be seeing this on C-SPAN eventually. And to echo one thing that Emily said, this is not just a conversation today about what the press did right and wrong. It's a conversation in part about innovation. Not only the innovations in technology around Twitter and social media, though those are important, but innovations in ethics, innovations in storytelling. Over the course of the last decade, we've had plenty of opportunities to, as journalists, to engage with large-scale tragedies. There are people in this room who covered 9/11. There are people in this room who covered Virginia Tech and will be joined by one of those later in the day. There are people probably here who covered Aurora, and we've tried as a profession to build on the knowledge gained, not only about how to intervene at the moment news breaks, but whose stories get told and why, whose names get mentioned and whose don't. And this conversation today will become part of that process, and indeed we hope will lead to some tip sheets and other permanent resources so that the next time journalists encounter an event like this, and the next time our communities encounter an event like this, we build on the knowledge. We'll also be talking perhaps a bit about the impact of covering an event like this on our community of journalists. We as journalists are human beings, and there are folks here who covered this story who may have things to say about that. We'll do Q&A, and when we do, after folks speak for a few minutes, my colleague Ariel Richen will bring the mic around the room. I would ask you, if you have a question, to A, make yourself known with your hand, B, to keep your questions or comments focused and concise, since we need to keep on schedule today, and I want to have as much time for conversation as possible. Okay, without further ado, our first panel for the next hour or so is entitled Breaking News and Trauma, and really what we want this part of the conversation to be looking back at the hours and days and weeks after the events of December 14th and look at the role of journalists and journalism and how we as a profession interacted and how we did. We're very lucky to be joined by some extraordinary folks. I should say that Jason Carroll from CNN has been called up to Boston, so he can't be here. But we do have a bunch of important people, and I'm going to try to do them in the order in which they're at the table so that our friends at C-SPAN can just pan the camera along. First of all, on my immediate right here is Pat Llodra, who is the first Selectwoman of Newtown. It is a privilege to have you here. As a Connecticut resident and as a citizen of the United States, it made me feel very good about the idea of political leadership to watch the compassion and care with which you responded to the worst kind of events that any community can endure. In her capacity as first Selectwoman, Patricia Llodra serves as chair of both the Education Subcommittee and the Communication Subcommittee and other committees within Newtown. She's been in Newtown since 1970, involved in local issues through membership in the Sandy Hook PTA, PTA Council, the St. Rose Parish Council, League of Women Voters, and the Republican Town Committee, 6 terms on the Board of Education. She's also got a whole bunch of fellowships and awards, which you can find in the bios that are on the table there. Next to her is from the Connecticut State Police, Lieutenant J. Paul Vance. He's the chief spokesperson for the Connecticut State Police. He's been a Connecticut State Trooper for more than 38 years. You don't look a day over 35. How can that be?
Thank you.
During his state police career, Lieutenant Vance has been assigned to patrol at both Troop L in Litchfield and Troop I in Bethany. He was assigned as a specialty canine handler, SWAT team member, helicopter medic, and to other various specialized assignments. In other words, this guy is not just a press flack. He is someone who has been at work for many years and understands the work of policing, understands as well, I think, the work of the press. And I know I said this to you earlier, I was impressed with the clarity and discipline of communication throughout this crisis, especially as someone who's watched some other mass shootings and other large-scale events. It was quite impressive. Next to Lieutenant Vance is Naomi Starobin, who is the news director of WSHU Public Radio, one of my local public radio stations where I live, covering Connecticut and Long Island, New York. She is the large station representative on the Public Radio News Directors Board and has been a board member there since 2009. She's a graduate of this school, the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and in previous careers was an environmental engineering consultant, a National Park Service ranger, and a teacher. And Naomi faced some very important challenges as the local public radio affiliate as this story broke and in the days and weeks afterward, contending not only with the tragic events themselves, but the impact on her staff. And we may talk about that. And finally, all the way at the end of the table, last but by no means least, is Brad Clift. Bradley Clift has devoted his lifetime to photography. Those of us who've lived in Connecticut a long time know his images from the Hartford Courant. These days he's a distinguished freelance photographer. During his 25-year journalism career, Clift has traveled to 44 countries and 45 states on assignment and documented some of the most important news events of our time, including Tiananmen Square in 1989, civil war and famine in Somalia in 1992, illegal immigration in Ecuador in 2003, and genocide in Sudan in 1905. We met at a social conversation for reporters and journalists who had covered Sandy Hook, and Brad's reflections on the choices he had made struck me. He's won more awards than you would care to say. A finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2003, National Newspaper Photographer Award, the RFK Award, and he's currently working on a 3-year project documenting the vitality of Hartford as a community. A portfolio of his human rights reporting was recently acquired by the Archives and Special Collections at the Thomas J. Dodd Research Center at the University of Connecticut. We're lucky to have all of you. I'm going to now move to the end of the table and carry on the conversation from there. I've been instructed to carry my card. I think what I'd like to ask each of you to do is to begin by taking us back to December 14th and the few days after that, and talk a little bit about the choices that you faced, either as journalists and news managers or in your leadership capacities, around the telling of this story, around communication with the public through the press. And think about some things that either you saw or perhaps in your own work that you thought were good choices and that folks did right. And then some things that you thought were really problematic and are things we should learn from. Maybe each of you talk for maybe 5 minutes or so, and then we'll run down this table and then have room for conversation both amongst this panel and in the room. So, Pat, do you want to start out?
I'm just getting a pen, sorry.
By all means. And while she does that, let me remind you again to please mute your cell phones, and our hashtag is AfterSandyHook. And Pat, you're the public face of Newtown,
Yes.
and you're rushing toward the school as a still confusing tragedy is happening. And then you also have to be the public face of Newtown as you find out what's happening, talking to the press. What were the choices you made about that? How did it go, and what did you observe?
The first thought that comes to my mind in response to that question is a statement that I made when the press was gathered at the first formal press conference located at our Treadwell Park. The message that I had to everyone gathered there is to remind them that it makes a difference to our community what you say. How you represent us will make a difference how we are seen to the world. We knew it made a difference for us how we comported ourselves, what we said, and the level of dignity that we need to evidence if we were not forever going to be known as the place where a horrible thing happened. But I also reminded all of the press gathered there that you hold our future a little bit in your hands, so please treat us gently, treat us with care. So that was the first and most important, I think, message that I sent out to the community, also through the media. It was my opportunity, knowing that the world was watching, to also have that message resonate with everyone in our community, that it matters too what each of us said and the way we conducted ourselves over the next weeks and, as it turns out, months and months, because the world is watching. And it was important for us, if we're going to be a thriving, healthy community in the future, that this not be an albatross, this not be our anchor. It has to be something that we can manage, that we can deal with, that we can somehow grow from and make positive things happen from. So that was the message. That was the first decision I made. And that really, more than anything, sprung from the time that I spent at the firehouse that day. There's nothing that's more present in my mind are the hours that I spent in the back room of the firehouse, and it was a very purposeful strategy put in place by the first responders and the state police and the other folks there, was to kind of divide the populations. The parents who successfully reunited with their children were able to leave the premises, were in a different part of the firehouse, and the families that were gathered in the back room of the firehouse were those families whose children had been so tragically involved in that event. So that was an hours-long event, so it did give me a lot of opportunity to think about what is my role. I am going to be the face of government, and I'm going to be the face of Newtown. Certainly a role that I never expected to be cast into, nor would I ever want, and I don't relish being in the position because of the message behind it. But in that time that I was in the back room of the firehouse with those families, knowing what was coming, knowing that within an hour or an hour and a half, or at some point, someone in charge is going to stand up and have to say to these families that your loved one has been killed. So the challenge that I had at that point was to talk to myself, say, who am I in this, and what is my job in this? How am I going to bear the weight over the next months and weeks and however long it takes for us to get back on track? And the word that kept resonating with me all the time is compassion, the importance of being compassionate, not only to understand the pain and the grief and the hard journey that individual families and parents were going to be following for the however long it took to get to that end, if there is an end, but also be compassionate with our town to understand that they've been rocked a little bit. This is a town that it's a small community, 28,000 people, middle class to some extent, but really perceived, I think, as probably upwardly upper class, a little bit more affluent than the typical community. Very safe, a town that loves families and children. We've always described ourselves as the kind of place where we want you to come if you want to have a happy, safe, fun environment with young kids, because that's what we do the best. And this was a school that did everything right. This was a school that had a lockdown procedure, a school that practiced drills, the school that knew exactly how to conduct itself if, in fact, they were in danger. There was no way that this school could have prevented this event. There's nothing they did to cause it. There's nothing the town did to cause it, but it happened to us, and it happened at the hands of a 20-year-old resident that was unknown to most of us. So the aftermath of that, too, of course, the questions that are going on that we're going to have to confront as a society, but certainly as a community and as a school district as well. So all of those messages are in my head all the time as I continue to try to find the right words to say and the right things to do to help model for the community the way forward. I'm not the entire government, but I am the face of the government. So again, people will automatically, in a town our size, 28,000 people with the selectman form of government, people will look to the person in that position to model the behaviors and model the actions that are important. So I guess in response to that question, what struck me from the very beginning is to be compassionate, clearly compassionate. I want to echo that. I want to say that a lot, because I think that the way forward for all of us is to understand the journey, but also to be able to translate that understanding into action. And, you know, compassion has that action element to it. It means that we have to do something about the situation we find ourselves in. So that's really what sprung forward for me as a compelling interest.
And what were you thinking of as you're there in the firehouse, bearing, as those of you who were there were, the enormous weight of these events? I can't even imagine. How were you understanding the role of the journalist that you were about to talk to? Who did you, what did you understand about the job? What did you
Wow.
see the job of journalists in that encounter as?
Well, not that it gives me any creds in this environment at all, but two things I want to tell you. One is my niece, Amy, was a student here at Columbia and is now a journalist working in Budapest, specializing in issues of media. And my Uncle Carl was the editor of the Jackson Citizen Patriot and won several Pulitzer Prizes for editorials that he wrote. In fact, the one that's most known is his editorial that really was the springboard for a National Day of Prayer. So I don't know if that gives me any creds at all when we're thinking about journalism, but I do have a little bit of a family history here with it. My first, just let me tell you a little bit of that story. When I arrived at the firehouse, the media was already there, which is amazing to me. I just don't know how that happened, because it was a 20-minute gap from the time I got the first call, went to the dispatch center to see what the status of things were, and then went to the firehouse, so 20 minutes were passed. And when I got to the firehouse, there were already a number of journalists of different media gathered in a location that was really difficult, really intrusive, and we knew the scope of what we were managing and knew that we had to remove the media from where they were. So my first interaction with the various media personnel was a little bit challenging, I have to say. Of course, they didn't know who I was, and nor did I bother introducing myself. But I, met each of them and said, please, will you go across the street and gather there, and someone will come over and talk to you soon. As soon as we identify who's going to be the public information officer for the event, you'll be taken care of. And the level of challenge, I was very surprised, even though I did not say, I'm the first selectman of the community and I have the authority to ask you to remove yourself from this location. I was a little bit surprised that at the level of disrespect. But I think, again, I'm trying to be also compassionate in the role of the media personnel. The event was very fluid, and there was it was horrific in its tone. Everyone could sense that this was something that was very big, and it really captured the attention of all the media personnel there. So that was my first interaction with them, and I can tell you that was not, it wasn't consistent. Mm-hmm. I did not experience that day after day after day after day. It was just that one time that I felt that the media was more interested in the activity than it was in respecting the fact that we were trying to gain some kind of control over the environment. I have, the overarching feeling that I have about the media treatment of our event and our community is a lot of things were done well. There were those things that were very challenging. The other thing I think of, however, is we're a very small community, a little hamlet, and the place at which the most of the media gathered was in this place called Sandy Hook Center. It's really an intersection of four roads. And the presence of the satellite trucks and the crews associated with those trucks was such that it totally shut down our commerce for weeks. for weeks and weeks. And this is a business center. This is a little economic driver for our community. And those businesses really they haven't bounced back yet. I think the impact was substantial. We kept trying to move the satellite trucks. I'd have different people go out to talk to the trucks. One truck would move and another truck would take their place. So we even found parking. We even created a place where trucks could go and park, and still they had to be reminded day after day after day after day. So there was a little bit of, and I know there was some animosity between the business owners and the satellite trucks who had so impacted their world. So that was another area in which it was very difficult. The early decision that I made relative to the media is that I'll spend some time working with the media if I think there's going to be a benefit for Newtown. And I had to and said no to 90% of the requests because the town needed me much more than the world needed my messages. Mm-hmm. So I had to find a way to deal directly and communicate directly with the community, which I did do using robocalls and news blasts and using our own local intranet capacity to get messages out to the community. That was much more important to me than it was to send messages out to the larger world. I did engage more of the media in the months that followed, but in that first 6 weeks, I routinely said no, that I just didn't have the time.
And we can come back to other issues. Paul, Lieutenant Vance, you tussle with the press every day. There's pushing and pulling, and you've got a job, and we've got a job, and this was different.
Yeah, this truly was different. Let me just back up a little bit and tell you how we got involved and how we tried to organize getting the message out, which was crucially important in any criminal case, but more importantly this one. Certainly it was a normal Friday when in fact the first call I got notifying me this, believe it or not, was from the press. A member of the press called and said, I understand there's been an incident at an elementary school in Sandy Hook. Well, I got to be honest with you, an incident in elementary school happens regularly where, a domestic violence type of thing, a husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, that's truly what interjected into my mind until the second and the third call came. And then we checked and we found there was multiple victims. And then we all went. And we have in Connecticut what's called an active shooter response. And we literally ran and got there as fast as we could get there. And the intent of an active shooter response certainly is to stop the aggression. Stop the aggression. Get there, get a team, and go in and stop what's going on. That occurred. And I have to say that when I got there, personally, it probably took me about 18 minutes to get there. I won't tell you how fast I drove or how far away I was. But needless to say, the aggression had been subsided. Children, many children had been rescued by many different law enforcement officers that responded there and did their work. And the most heartbreaking thing that anyone can ever endure is to see the death of a child. And what was even more difficult was seeing parents being reunited with their children and breaking down and having a very, very difficult time that their child survived and they knew others didn't. But that was the beginning. We had to get all that done first before we even worried about the press. I mean, there were times when nothing against photographers, but there'd be a photographer in a way and say, sir, please step back. You didn't have time to discuss or explain what you needed. Our needs were emergent and immediate. So we would move people back. And finally, once the children were reunited, we had, unfortunately, 20 families that were waiting and understanding children don't carry IDs, and we have to be very exacting in what we say. And the other 6 families, the adults that we had accounted for, but again, we had 26 families that we had to tell terrible news to, and we had to do it right. While we were working on that, I was partnered up with a lieutenant from Newtown Police Department who really has become a very, very good friend. As a matter of fact, I think he owes me a steak dinner. But he and I work very, very closely together, and we put together a location for the media because I've been doing this as a public information officer for 13 years. And I steal things from people. Yes, I'm a law enforcement officer, but I do steal things from people. I steal ideas. I steal ways to do things. Every seminar that I go to, every class that I teach on media relations to public safety, I find a better way to do things, or a newer way, or a different way. And we knew we needed to have an area where we could put all the media in one place and set up this media staging area. That was going to be the location where all the information was going to be disseminated. The leaders in law enforcement got together, the state police, the local police, and other federal authorities got together and decided the state police were going to be the lead investigatory agency in this terrible tragedy, and working with Newtown police, and then support by all the other law enforcement agencies. As a result of that, I became the spokesman and the only spokesman for this event. And really the importance of that is I'm no better or no worse than anybody else, but it was simply super important that in a situation, a tragedy like this, that there be no misinformation given out, that the information be timely and accurate, and it come from one source. Multiple sources with a different preposition, adverb, or what have you could cause a misinterpretation of information. By coming from one voice and one individual, we felt that was important. So we got the message out via all the avenues that we have, including, believe it or not, the old-fashioned fax machine. We sent out to everyone, Treadwell Park is where the media staging area will be. All information, or the first press conference was probably about 2 hours or 2.5 hours after the incident occurred. The local, state, and federal leaders that were there, and not because Pat's sitting right next to me, were phenomenal. They were phenomenal, and I can't say that enough. They came together at the first press conference, and at the recommendation of myself and other media relations people, wanted to get the message out. Pat to the local community, the governor to the state community, and even some of the federal officials, just by being there to let them know that at this tragedy we had all the support that was going to be necessary to accomplish whatever objectives we needed to accomplish. And so they did their thing, and then I stepped to the microphone, introduced myself to those who I didn't know, told them what the schedule would be, told them what the ground rules were, and there were a couple of real important ground rules. And one was that if it didn't have my name attached to it as being information from this terrible, terrible, horrific tragedy, then consider it suspect, consider it questionable, because there's nothing that would come out that would not have my name attached to it as being authentic information. And that was important, and right away we wanted to quell the rumor mills, because I've learned a great deal from members of the media and from people in the press, whether it's electronic or otherwise, and I knew that they wanted to know where to go for that information. I still get cell phone calls from people out of New York today. I mean, literally still, because I would give them my cell phone, and I would say, make sure it's important. If you call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, I get cranky. All right, but make sure that the information you're looking for is extremely important, because I'll get it for you. We did presentations about every 90 minutes as appropriate. We had to go back, once we set the ground rules, we went back an hour and a half or so later and said, look, there are fatalities. And yes, there are fatalities that included little babies, and it breaks my heart as I look at these pictures in the back of the room. I was there, okay, and I saw the tragedy, and I saw the carnage. And we couldn't put out information to the press about any of the details about the tragedy that occurred, because who was first and foremost on our mind? The victims' families. They needed to know first, not to hold back from anybody else. The community was already informed by the leaders of the community that they were safe, but the families needed to have their information first. They needed to know first, and then everyone else second. And that truly was the thought process in the back of my mind.
And Paul, let me ask you this. Had you been in the scene? Had you been inside the school?
Yes. I will automatically go into a crime scene just so that I know firsthand as to what we're talking about and what we can articulate.
So you're forming the strategy while you've got the immediate scene in your head as well.
Oh, absolutely. And that in and of itself is horrific, but was even more heart-wrenching was having to see the families who put their babies on the bus to go to school know that their babies weren't coming home. And that broke my heart, and to this day it breaks my heart to even think about it. But let me continue on. What occurred was the press, after every press conference, I would give them as much information as I could, knowing that they had readership, they had electronic presentations to make, they had to get their message out. I would give them as much as possible, but not ahead of the families, not ahead of the families. And as each conversation would conclude, each press conference would conclude, I would have question and answers, because I want to know where they were going, they, the members of the press, what they were looking for, what areas of interest were, did they need answered. And there were some that I would simply say to them, I'll get that answer. And if I could, I would get the information and bring it back to them. But we couldn't put the cart ahead of the horse, remembering what I said, families first. The press got it, and I got to say this. I've been dealing with the press for almost 13 years. And I've had some battles, you know, in the press dealing with different topics over the years. I think I've learned, as I said before, what they need and what their objectives are. I know what their deadlines are. I know a lot of it. I learned a lot from the press over the years. But I got to tell you, the press in this situation got it. I stood, as the first Selectwoman said, at Treadwell Park and looked out over a sea of media that even standing next to Governor Malloy said to me, Lieutenant, I have never seen this massive press in my entire political career. And he's traveled all over the world with the press and with the media. It was simply unbelievable. But every single one of them, and there's one that I'll allude to for a second, but every single one of them treated this horrific tragedy with respect and dignity. And I said at one point in time to the members of the Associated Press, if there was a way that I could send a message to the press, not for publication, but a general message to the members of the press, I would have no problem whatsoever, and my counterpart from Newtown PD would have no problem whatsoever saying that the men and women of the media, of the press that handled the horrific tragedy at the Sandy Hook Elementary School did so with class. They did so with feeling. In a nutshell, they got it. They truly got it. I said to them at one point in time very early, please, leave the families alone. Let them grieve. Let them deal with the tragedy that that they're experiencing starting today. And I said that several times. And again, they got it. They left them alone. They truly left them alone. There was one photographer, nothing against photographers, but there was one photographer that that felt that it was necessary to take a photograph of survivors, one family. And a trooper called me and he said, Lieutenant, he said, I got this photographer. He's from the big city, so he wasn't even from Connecticut, from the big city, from New York. And he was bound and determined he was getting that photograph. And I said to him, in all fairness and all candid, I said, ask him to leave. I said, if he doesn't leave, make sure he abides by every single law you can think of that's on the books in the state of Connecticut. If he's walking on the roadway, that's dangerous. He's going to get himself hurt. If he's parked illegally, that's just unacceptable if we got to get an ambulance or a fire truck through. I said, please, make him understand. He left. He left.
I know the conversation's going to come all the way back at some point, and I want to give some examples for what Paul is saying about how the media really were extraordinarily respectful and competent and comprehensive, but there's also those events that I want to point out that I think are learning opportunities for people in the profession to see it from the perspective of someone that was in the eye of the storm for a long time.
Yeah, no, we will circle back. That's going to be very important. Let me take it, Naomi, to you. You are the manager of a public radio station that has a serious news operation, but is usually dealing with a fairly limited palette of news stories, some community, some statewide or over on Long Island. The information comes in, the story is what it is. What were the choices you faced, and how did you negotiate that?
There were choices on many levels. The first thing to do was that I needed to do was to get somebody or somebodies up to the scene. And actually, I learned about what happened while my first reporter was on his way. So he heard it, got in his car wisely, and then called me. So that was fine. But that really, and we're a staff of about 10. Some people just host. So field reporters, 3 or 4 or 5, depending on the time of day and all that. So I sent another reporter up pretty much immediately with a little bit more equipment, a MiFi card and a laptop, another laptop. And we find that what happens is that one reporter goes to the park, to Treadwell Park, first the firehouse, then the park, and waits. you know, because you're waiting for the press conference. Meanwhile, that person's in a bit of a vacuum and needs so much support from the studio, which is what the rest of us were doing at that time. Because we were hearing lots of things going back and forth with reporter, and when we heard the number go from 1 or 2 up, we said that to our field reporter who had heard that but considered it a rumor at that point, and he said, you know, we, meaning he and the other reporters there, don't believe it because we're not seeing any parents who can't find their kids, and that's because you wisely separated them. So it just took a while for everybody to catch up with the truth. We had to make programming decisions back at the station because we send out, for most of the day, 2 different signals, or 3 sometimes. One is classical music and the other is news and talk. So do we interrupt classical music with this news, or do we let the people who love classical music find refuge in the music? So that was, you know, not necessarily my decision, but a decision that had to be made. What else?
You also, in the sort of the days afterward, really sort of had to think about staffing and how to
Yeah.
take care of your people. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, enough is enough at some point. If you have 2 full days of intense reporting in a situation like that, that's really enough. You need a day off. And it was the weekend, and we aren't used to staffing up on the weekends, but everybody, you know, was all hands on deck. And we had lots of hosts to sub in and out. And one thing I found is that when you are hosting a news show and this is happening in your state, you may not be in Newtown reporting, you may not see the families of the victims, but you are talking about it and hearing about it for, you know, 4 or 5 hours at a time. And that's really rough. You know, that's really rough. And I had to think about that.
You're also the community station for Newtown. How did that change news choices you made, or the sort of the dynamic for the station?
Well, I'm so glad to hear what you say, Lieutenant Vance, about the press. So we certainly tried to be respectful. I mean, none of us, from a sort of personality point of view, are sort of aggressive, obnoxious reporters, and I'm happy about that. And I guess I'd have to say, you know, our philosophy is not to get it first, but to get it right, and you've heard that before from many places I know. And also, because we're the community, we're part of the community, we're in it for the long haul. And I think our respect for people in Newtown, and we did back off when that was the message we were getting, although we don't have a satellite truck. We're in it for the long haul, and that earned us credit, I think, at times like now, several months later, when we are now going back and talking to families who want to talk. They have a very nice PR machine going, the families in Newtown, and have a real good procedure set up for getting in touch with people. And we've been able to talk to some of the families of the victims now, several months later, 2 or 3 months later, and that's been good. And we're still there. We're planning a big 6-month events and coverage of where are we now. So,
Brad, images. I think for most of us in this room, we relate to an event like Sandy Hook, or to Sandy Hook in particular, more through the pictures and the images that come in through both still photos and video, more than anything else. We read the stories and the words register, but it is the images that haunt us. You're there as a photographer with choices to make about images. You're there as a photographer who's done a whole lot of this kind of stuff, and as someone who's had your own experience being sometimes written about. Talk about the choices you made and choices you saw other photographers making, and where that goes for you.
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me and being part of this. And I think one of the reasons you invited me is because the perspective that I can bring to this. It is 35 years of photojournalism professionally, and it is, as you said in my resume, covering the world. Working for The Current for 20 years, I had the unique position of being able to do pretty much anything I wanted to the last 10 years, but the first 10 years were doing daily local journalism. And the only thing that I can add to this whole perspective is the perspective of a photojournalist. And one of the things I want to speak as the background to this is one of the last things I did before leaving The Current was I went to Darfur and Sudan. I was captured there, I was tortured there, and I was imprisoned for 15 days. That kind of changed my whole perspective on everything. About 6 months later, I left the newspaper. Very hard to understand when any journalist or any individual goes through something that's traumatic. But when you go to cover the news and then you become the news, it's an entirely different perspective. But that perspective is what gives me this unique view of coming back after having that being written about by your own newspaper, being written about by publications, and being the subject of newspaper, magazine, and university studies about this type of thing. Now you're a victim. Now you're what you reported on for, in my case, 30 years. So the reason I bring this up is not so much to talk about me, but a perspective of photojournalists. Because once I came back from Darfur, that whole different, being the subject instead of being the journalist, is a different side of the same coin. And the reason it's important is that I didn't want to do journalism when I came back. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. And so for 7 years, I didn't have much to do with it. The first assignment I did after Darfur that was long-term was Sandy Hook. So when I got the call that day, because I had told some friends and editors in New York, I'm now ready to come back. So the next story that comes up, please consider me. So I got a call from Michelle, and she's from Reuters, McLaughlin, was the first independent photojournalist on the scene next to, I think, the Sandy Hook Bees photographer, and took some of the most iconic photographs of that day. She basically told me that you have to get down here. And so I didn't get there right away. I got there that evening. But I have to tell you the hesitation. And the first news alert I got, I have a son in elementary school here in Connecticut. The first news I get in CBS News and CNN News alerts. It said, shooting in Connecticut schools, children are victims. And of course, we think, as anybody who had a child in Connecticut school, is that my school? Is that my child? So I called the school first, and they said, we know nothing of that kind of thing. And then I got other calls from editors, are you available? So I actually made sure that my son was home safely, and then I went down, which was late in the afternoon. But everything I would have to say from this point forward would be from the perspective of a parent, a photojournalist, and somebody who left the profession and came back and now brings this perspective of absolute sensitivity for the victims. So for me, when I got there, and what was really strange, and remember, I have been to all these countries, and I have been in the middle before the troops came to Somalia, before anybody went to Syria, before people went to Iraq. All those places, I was there before the United States military got involved. In fact, I was there for the reason photojournalists go to these things. That is to get iconic images that show what's going on so that people will give, give a care about what's going on in the world. In the case of Sandy Hook, you're walking up that road and it's quiet. It's not like any other news event I think I've ever been to. Plus the trepidation that I had walking up that road was, what am I gonna find and what am I gonna see? And frankly, I'm being as personal as I can be, I don't wanna be here. I don't wanna do this. I had to force myself up that road. When I've talked to Michelle, and I've talked to Michelle at length about this, mostly because I'm writing a book about the perspective of photojournalists, because I don't think people understand what it is we are trying to do. In many cases, people think we're trying to exploit the situation when in fact we're trying to explain visually what's going on, which is very different than what writers are trying to do. Very different, because we do have to be there when things happen. We do have to be there in the middle of things. And for us, news conferences aren't as important. They're important in getting information for us to try to figure out what we're going to do next. But for us, it's very important to be there when these things are happening. And when we're standing there talking, and we know that there are parents coming out after hours and hours of being inside, it's very difficult to photograph those things. It's something that I think, like I said, most of us don't want to do, but it's our job. And now, having done it for 35 years, then taken 7 years off, After Boston, after Aurora, after Columbine, after Sandy Hook, and we're here to talk about Sandy Hook, I am more convinced than ever that photojournalism plays a vital role in understanding not only what happened, but in connecting us as communities to what's happening. What I found in Sandy Hook is a city of sorrow, that when you walked up that day, the silence was deafening. I know that sounds like overstatement, but it was.
And as a photographer, how did you engage with that silence? Did you seek more permission than you ordinarily do? What kind of choices did you make in the face of that?
Distance. You do not, again, I didn't get there in the first 20 minutes, so I'm there hours later. But my colleagues who did get there in the first half hour, as I understand it, when talking to Michelle and talking to Chloe from the Hartford Courant, Michelle was Reuters, another photographer from AP, they were across the street. They had the longest lenses out. They were trying to be as respectful as possible. They did not want to walk up with a wide angle and shoot people suffering knowledge of a loved one who they found out had just died. On the other hand, some of those pictures that were taken were exactly of that, of people finding out that they had just lost a loved one. It is heart-wrenching to not only see that, but it is also very difficult to photograph that, not only from my perspective, but from the three women who I talked to in detail about what they saw and what they felt about what they were seeing. And I think what they felt was what most people feel. And what's so different about Sandy Hook is that we knew that they were 6-year-olds. We knew that they were children that were, this wasn't Virginia Tech where 20-year-olds could run away, or even 17-year-olds in Columbine. This is now so far afield from what we're all used to, the most well-read and the most experienced spokesperson for the state police or for the police or for the politicians. I can't even imagine and nobody could imagine, what it was to see what was going on inside. And there were photographers, by the way, who were talking about, and I'm not going to pick on New York, but the fact of the matter is there are pressures for people to get the scene. There are photographers talking about the scene. How do we get to the scene? And the rest of us looked at them like, not here, you're not going to the scene. You're not going to try to sneak into the scene. Not with us watching, not with us nearby. We don't, in Connecticut, we're not going to do that. Nobody around here is going to sneak into the scene. And I think, again, you're talking about extreme elements. Most people are extremely respectful of the situation. And like I said, shot from across the street. The next day, people were coming up and very quietly placing flowers, teddy bears, tree ornaments, photographs, poems, all sorts of things. And that's one of the things we photograph and try to, again, with long lenses to do that. There are exceptions to that. But by and large, most photographers were back a ways. In fact, at one point, a woman would not come to the memorial because she was afraid of all the press that was there. So an AP photographer came up and said, you guys, she wants to come up and put this teddy bear here. Can you just not photograph it? And you'd think that some, asshole photojournalist would say, well, I'm not abiding by that. But we did. We stopped. Everybody stopped. He went and helped her up, sat down, placed the teddy bear there, and he actually prayed with her. And nobody photographed that scene. I'm just giving you that perspective because it was different than almost anything else I've ever been at, where there is kind of this almost out of control atmosphere where everybody's kind of freelancing and flying in and shooting and doing whatever they can to take photographs and get their notes and do their stories. But the fact of the matter was, in this instant, I think everybody recognized that this was a historic massacre on a level that we have never seen and hopefully we'll never see again. But from a perspective of a photojournalist, we are there to try to get images that are what it does feel like, what it does look like, and those images do become part of history. And that's what we're trying to do.
We're going to go in a minute to the room, but let me ask you, I want to go down the room and go down the line here and have you quickly say maybe the the best thing you saw or experienced a journalist doing, and the thing that, really the worst thing that you saw. And then we can come back and maybe talk about it a little more, but I want to make sure there's time for the room too. But Pat, best thing, worst thing?
The best thing I think is the, over time, the consideration granted me and others by serious journalists who really wanted to have a conversation about how are things going, what is the story here, do you have 15 minutes to spend with me, can I make an appointment to come and see you? Maybe you can send me some comments in writing. You know, some real understanding the levels of pressure that I was under, and not accosting me as I'm trying to go from spot to spot, or trying to go and meet with a family, or trying to do something that had to be done in the town. So the worst is the flip side of that consideration shown by those who learned to be very respectful of my time. The flip side is the pursuit that I experienced by some journalists, that, you know, the parking in my driveway, the calling my private phone, calling my husband, calling my son, who happens to live in Manhattan, saying, can you get me access to your mom? You know, it's that kind of, the pursuit was overwhelming, and, you know, was, what I think journalists don't understand in an event like this is that a small town like Newtown, we don't have a communications office or a division that we can hand this off to. I'm the face of the government, but I'm also the face that journalists are going to try to get the official line from. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't uncommon for me to go into the building at 7:30 in the morning and find 30 or 40 reporters gathered there waiting to following me into my office wanting to comment. So the bad thing is the pursuit. Mm-hmm. The good thing is that most journalists learned over a couple of weeks' time the best way to get some information from me was to treat me with that level of consideration, ask for my comments, ask for an appointment, call me up, ask me to send something in writing. You know, be quick, be clear, be focused, and then move on.
Lieutenant Vance, best choice, worst mistake?
I think I've stated it, the best thing I saw in my 13 years of dealing with the press is the respect that the members of the press gave to the people of the community, to the victims, to the horrific nature of this criminal event. And yes, it was a criminal event. And I think they also recognize the fact that we would treat the press equally, that ABC didn't have it over NBC and the Current didn't have it over the Register and so on and so forth, that we made sure during the entire event it was equal footing for all. So if I had something to release, it was released at that location, and they all got it all at the same time once it's to be released. And I think I can't really say anything negative. There were some questions that after the Q&A, after each press conference, there were some questions that were, I'll just simply say, inappropriate, but I wanted to hear what they were looking for, and I wanted to be able to say, we're not going to discuss that, or that's something that we're not going to be able to provide you.
And just to help us out, because journalists will be trying to learn from this, what were those kinds of questions that were really inappropriate at that moment?
Description of the scene, location of the scene, and honestly, in all fairness, I can understand their inquisitiveness. I truly can, but it just was inappropriate for us to divulge it at the time, and some people were a little bit offended by it. But once I was able to articulate that we wouldn't provide that, and some basic clear reasons as to why, they got it. I can't say that enough. They got it.
Naomi, best choice, either someone on your staff or something you admired, and most problematic thing?
Well, there's the whole sense of reporters rising to the occasion. None of them had been through anything like this. I'm thinking, in addition to my field reporters, I'm thinking of a producer who's 22 or 3 years old, who had just been hired a couple of months beforehand, who just went all out, was there all weekend with me, bringing in tape from the field and dealing with phone calls and cutting tape, and just, you know, talk about rising to the occasion in many ways. I mean, we made some of the same mistakes that other news outlets made right off the bat with incorrect facts about who the shooter was and whether the mother worked at the school. We kind of relied on Associated Press for that and attributed it to them, but it was wrong. So I don't know what we would have done in retrospect, except to wait with so many facts, but it was a rough decision to make at the time. And I just have to throw one other thing in, and that is something that surprised me as a news director of situation that I hadn't managed before, and that is how much media from all over the world is calling us, our reporters, and relying on us to transmit information, and how wrong some of these people were, because all they got were the rumors through Twitter or Facebook or whatever they were looking at, just information that, so our duty at that point was to sort of correct information, and my reporters were getting woken up at 3 or 4 in the morning by people halfway across the world with these questions, and I feel like we served this other function, which wasn't only to illuminate our listeners, but to really spread the message and sort of keep the rumors tamped down a little bit.
Brad, briefly, best choice, worst choice that you observed or got up your nose?
Well, I think the scene I described before was the best one. I think that's, and by the way, I wasn't there for that one. That is something Michelle McLaughlin told me about. So I described it as if I was there. I was not there when that teddy bear was brought and the photojournalist prayed with the woman. But again, the sources of that are impeccable, and I think that's one of the things you just don't think of photojournalists doing, which is setting down their cameras and helping out, although I've seen it around the world many, many times. The thing is, I think that the best of it is, and part of the worst of it is, that's the best, the worst of it is this is a generational thing, and having a son who's totally into technology, is the rumor mill, is exactly what Naomi was talking about with so many things that are wrong on social media. I mean, you can see this in Boston too, about, even choosing the wrong kid and putting him on the front page. Was it the Daily News or the Post?
New York Post.
Okay, the Post. Well, again, you're gonna have to look at the source from which it's coming. For me, it's one of the reasons why photojournalism is so important, because while there are people out there who say, well, yeah, it's easier than ever to make up pictures. Absolutely is. Easier than ever to make up things that you put on Twitter or Facebook or anywhere, all the other social medias. But the fact of the matter is, in most cases, the documentary photojournalism is still looked upon as a document of truth.
Okay, and we will come back to social media questions in a big way in a little while. Let's now go to the room. Ariel, where are you with the mic? If folks who have something you want to engage the panel with, can hold up here. Okay, in the striped shirt in the back. What we'll do for the sake of cameras is take a couple questions from this side, a couple questions from that side.
Hi.
And identify yourself if you would.
All right. Mike Patrick from the Republican American newspaper in Waterbury, Connecticut. Lieutenant, we speak all the time. Actually, this is a question for you, because this goes back to the whole rumor mill thing. When there's a rumor that is widespread and rampant, like the one about the mother teaching at the school, does the state police feel a responsibility or pressure or anything to spend time with the press correcting that, saying, well, listen, I know that this is something that's out in the media. This is wrong. Here's what we do now.
Sure, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I had a partner from Newtown that was with me all the time, because I never put my big toe in Newtown prior to the tragedy. I can be very candid with you. So there was a lot of information, or a lot of places to get this information that I was not aware of. We had, and that was one of the Q&As after one of the press conferences, someone made that statement, and my answer was just like this: I'm not sure, but I will get you that answer. And within the next 2 hours, we had that answer. Unfortunately, some of that stuff was tweeted all over the place, and it took quite a while before I could emphatically stand there and say there was no affiliation with the school, that's been confirmed by the first Selectwoman's office, the Board of Education, the Superintendent of Schools, and we were able to quell the rumors. There was another one, and I'll throw it out there, was the identity of the shooter, who, by the way, whose name I do not repeat and will not repeat until the day I die. But they had the wrong name. Someone stood up in the crowd and said, I understand the shooter was so-and-so. Well, that was wrong. That was wrong. And I was able to stand up without identifying the shooter and simply say, that is incorrect information. I can emphatically say that name is incorrect. It should not be used. We have a tentative identification that we're not prepared to release at this time. So we do want to quell the rumors, and that's the reason why I would take questions after every press conference to see what the information was that was out there and do what we could, because we want to be timely, but more importantly, we want to be accurate when we make any kind of statements. Thank you for the question.
And an interesting question related to that for us as journalists, I think, is as rumors are coming out, whether it's through social media or the old-fashioned way, do we, in this fast-moving world, not only have a responsibility to verify what we ourselves are going to publish, but do we have a responsibility to challenge bad information that's out there? Interesting question, but maybe we'll get into with the social media. Let's take one more from this side of the room, and then we'll go over to that side. Yes?
Hi, I guess this question is for both Pat and Lieutenant Vance. I wondered how often and where you briefed the families. Were they briefed individually? I know that you had someone assigned to each of the families. So how did you communicate with the families and keep them informed in advance of the press?
I think both of us can respond to that. We come to this from different perspectives. First of all, let me say that I think it was an extraordinary stroke of genius to assign a police officer to each of the families. Not only did it provide protection for those families from any potential onslaught of media since their names were being revealed. It also provided an opportunity for us to communicate with the families, and that's what my office did, was use those police officers that were assigned to those families as a vehicle to get information directly to the families. So what we would do from my office is communicate either with Lieutenant Vance or with our police chief, Mike Keogh, if we had critical information that had to get to the families, knowing that it would get to the families clearly, it would be consistent, it would be fair, it would be communicated in the appropriate fashion. So that's how we use that position.
Yeah, and as I alluded to before, one of the most difficult things that we had to do from the criminal investigative point of view, if you will, was to inform the families, and there was no easy way to do it. We knew we had to do it as quickly as we possibly could, and we had to get, but understand, as I said before, children don't have identifications in their pocket. So we have to have a positive identification. We can't go in and say, I think little Johnny is deceased. We had to be able to say that, yes, we've located your son or your daughter, and tragically, the child has lost their life. And that took time, and that was very, very hard to do. We were able to go in and say to the 26 families who lost their loved ones that we believe that your loved one is deceased. They had to give us some time. We got things done, which I won't allude to. We got things done very quickly, much quicker than normal, so that we could bring the terrible, horrific, tragic news to these individual families the minute we had it.
There was also, the governor was involved as well and wanted to be in that room, as I recall.
The governor was in that room, and it was the governor who made that first announcement to all the folks that were in the back room that their loved one had been killed. The other vehicle I use, by the way, to correspond with the families is a robocall. So that practice began months ago, years ago it feels now, with the horrific weather events that we had. So it is common in my community for me to use that as a vehicle to get a message to all of the residents in our community. Almost everyone is signed on to the robocall service with their landline and their cell phones. So that's a method that I use.
Let's take a couple questions from this side of the room. Anybody? Someone? Room full of journalists? Come on. Another question over here. Okay.
Hi, sorry, a bit of sore throat. I'm just wondering if, my name's Genevieve Bellmaker, I'm with the Epoch Times here in New York, and I'm wondering, this is sort of for both of you, but for anybody, if the size of your town and community made a difference in the response, both the response of the community and the response of the media, because I'm thinking in my head of what happened in Boston, and what you're describing is so different. So I just wonder if, Boston being a big city and then your small community, if that made a difference maybe.
From my perspective, yes. It was overwhelming for us to have that much media in our town, and the presence felt so intrusive sometimes that, residents would be calling and coming to my office saying, can't you just make them leave? Can't you make them go home? It felt overwhelming to us to be in every newspaper every day and on every TV channel it felt like months and months and months, and it was wearing us down so much so that I was worried about the spirit of our community. So I think the size mattered. It felt at some point that we had as much media as we do residents. We have 28,000 residents, and it felt that we couldn't turn a corner. They were in the diners, they were in the local retail area. They'd be walking up and down the street. They were always at the memorials trying to interview people, and again, trying to be very respectful. I do agree with Lieutenant Vance that the media really got it, with the exception of very few. But it's hard to be a journalist looking for a story without being intrusive. I mean, you want to talk to people, you want to take photographs, you want to ask those hard questions. We want to be respectful. The journalists also have editors that are saying, go get that story. We understand that, but it felt overwhelming to us because we are a small town, and we're a very close-knit community as well.
We also, just to dovetail off of that, when we were done giving out information relative to the investigation, the last press conference I held, just prior to that press conference, we had a meeting to determine how are we going to get the media to go home. And I mean that sincerely. As you look through this sea of media, how are we going to get them to go home? Because one fear that existed was that they would further invade the community, and the community was already pretty well overwhelmed. I got to tell you, I'm going to say it again, they got it. They went home. They knew there was no other information coming out from these lips. Everything would be done electronically. That after that, they packaged up their stuff, and a majority of them went home. They went home. And again, I think out of mutual respect. And one thing I can say about First Selectwoman's community was phenomenal. Phenomenal. There were people that would walk up to troopers who were doing their duty because they felt they were underfed or undercoffeed, and would bring them coffee. There were ladies bringing cookies. The community came together in my 39 years as a trooper like nothing I have ever seen in my life.
Naomi, let me kind of give you the last word on this panel, because you are the community journalist here. This is your community. How did you understand your station's role being? Do you feel as if the community appreciated what you were doing? How did folks relate to you as SHU was breaking this and then dealing with it over time?
Well, we've gotten compliments from listeners about how respectful we were with the coverage. And being a community station, we also were able to find sources easily because somebody at the station knows somebody who lives next to you just have those immediate ways to find people to talk to you about the news. I mean, it was just sort of compliments from our listeners about our coverage.
Okay. Well, let's leave it there. I want to thank all of our panelists for beginning our conversation today by taking us back to a place that I know they would probably rather not go back to. It actually takes some courage to be having this honest conversation today. So Pat and Lieutenant and Naomi and Brad, thank you. Let's take 10 minutes break, and we will come back for the next panel. Quick logistical information. There's a women's room immediately to your left as you go out. Halfway down the hall, there's a unisex restroom. There's an authorized men's room all the way down to the basement. 10 minutes. Thank you, folks.
12:30 anyway, I said I can't.
Going back. And the other thing is walking into 7 years. That small enclave that is.
This is one of these weird days where it's near the school, a whole day conversation.
Everyone's very much happy to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
I'm sure you know where the mall.
I kind of.
I listen to that all the time.
I mean, I got to leave. That's my job.
I didn't, but that would have been a gift because we couldn't go and it felt honored.
Would you do us the honor, and I'll get in touch later, participating some of our 6-month. Oh, absolutely. We'll have a live event for listeners.
Well, you know,
This weekend.
Postboston. I had, I think about 35 calls since Boston.